All right, so we're going to talk about the Age of Jefferson a little bit more here. We're going to start with this idea of mapping the West. I think the last thing we talked about was this one, where we purchased the Louisiana Territory, and I'd gone out of my way to tell you that, in my opinion, this alone puts Jefferson up there as one of the great presidents we've ever had, greatest president we've ever had. The fact that he doubled the size of the United States for such a great price. But then we had to map the area. So he looked long and hard to try and find just the right person to go out there and map this. And he ended up finding his personal secretary. So he sends out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to map the area, along with a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. And they were told to catalog the flora and fauna. That just means draw pictures of the plants and animals. Pretty important trip. I think we've already covered that. So let's go ahead and move on to the next section and talk about some of the problems Jefferson had. Jefferson intended to be a peacetime president. Thomas Jefferson never wanted to be a warrior. In fact, it's really hard for me to even imagine Jefferson as a warrior. He's the guy that as governor of Virginia, fled the capital as the redcoats came in from the other side. But European war is going to start to interfere a little bit with America at this time. In 1803, Britain and France renewed their centuries-old war. Really, if you want to know what goes on with Britain and France, it's a family struggle. The kings and queens of France were related to each other. In fact, the King of England owned more of France than the King of France did at this time. So there was a lot of problems here. And since France and England were fighting each other, it became important to dominate the United States and figure out exactly what it is that the U.S. was going to do. So in 1806, Parliament passed something called the Orders in Council, which made it illegal for any foreign ship to trade with France. So this means that if the United States decided to sell any goods to France, that England would consider it an act of war and they would attack us. Well, okay, fine. We kind of accepted that and said, we'll just trade with England. But then Napoleon Bonaparte reciprocated and said any foreign ship that trades with British ports will be seized. So basically what it comes down to is the only two countries in the world that were really buying American goods, and if you traded with either one, the other considered it an act of war. So we were kind of in trouble. We were in the middle of a trade war. And then England began practicing something called impressment. By the way, this is still on the books in England. This is still technically legal. It hasn't been done since World War I, but it is still technically legal. Under English common law, particularly the English naval law, if an English ship's captain doesn't have enough men to support the Navy, to support his ship, he can impress any English citizen into the Navy. And the way this usually works is they end up going into a small port town, they go to a bar, they buy drinks, and when you pass out drunk, some big burly sailor throws you over his shoulder and carries you on the ship and it pulls out to sea. You sober up and there's no escape, you're out at sea. That's called impressment. Sometimes they used press squads where they would just go into cities and grab people. Sometimes they would board ships and take you off. But the deal is they had to be they had to be English citizens. Well, England's got this situation where they don't recognize naturalization. So once you're born an English citizen, you stay an English citizen forever, okay? So between 1808 and 1811, they impressed about 6,000 Americans into service in the British Navy. Well, how do you get away with that? Well, they don't recognize that they were ever naturalized. They were born British. They still consider them British, okay? If you figure that the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1787, this is only 25 years later. So So it's kind of not surprising at all. All right, let's talk about the most famous duel in American history. Alexander Hamilton versus Aaron Burr. You know, a few years ago, I could talk about this, and nobody got excited, and everybody just kind of looked at me and had no idea what was going on. And then that musical came out, and now everybody knows about the duel between Hamilton and Burr. By the way, if you haven't seen that musical, then you're a communist. You need to go see it. So let's talk about this because it's one of the most interesting things that's ever happened, I think, in American history. And it's between two people that are amazing. Alexander Hamilton, who was probably the smartest man in the country at this time period, and Aaron Burr, who was probably the sleaziest man in the country. These guys are less than a year apart in age. They're both from New York. They were both lawyers who had argued cases against each other. They both served in Washington's army, where they distinguished themselves well. So they have a lot of things in common. But that's kind of where it stops. Hamilton was literally a self-made man. Hamilton was born the illegitimate child of a servant woman in the Caribbean. There's been a lot of speculation that he might have been the child of a servant woman and a slave man. That's never been proven, but there were a lot of people that suggested that back in the day. Hamilton literally was recognized for his brilliance and sent off to university while still 14 years old. He is a true self-made man. Burr, however, is the son of New England nobility, for lack of a better term. His grandfather was a famous Puritan minister. His family had tons of money. He was born into politics. Hamilton was an arch-federalist, the founder of the Federalist Party. Burr was an opportunistic anti-federalist, or by this point, Jeffersonian Republican. And these two had despised each other for years. You remember back in the election of 1800, when Hamilton had conspired to prevent John Adams from becoming president. And his plan was to throw just enough votes to Burr to make Adams come in second and Pinckney come in first. His plan backfired. Burr and Jefferson tied for the presidency 35 times. But in the end, it was Hamilton that came through and said, you know what? I don't like Jefferson, but we can't have this guy Burr as our president. So Burr's chance at being president was stopped by Hamilton. He was discredited as vice president. It was obvious he wasn't going to be able to ticket the second time with Jefferson. So in 1804, Burr decided to go run for governor of New York. And Hamilton made it his personal mission in life to destroy Burr. And through newspapers and public statements, he did nothing but ridicule Burr and ridicule Burr's accomplishments. And Burr got just destroyed in the gubernatorial race. Blames Hamilton again. And these two guys just constantly said bad things about each other. Well, the straw that broke the camel's back was when someone went to Burr and told him that Hamilton, how can I put this gracefully? Hamilton questioned his parentage, okay? Basically, Hamilton said, I don't think your daddy is your daddy, okay? Suggested that his mama had messed around. Now, guys, I've read much of Hamilton's work. I love Hamilton. Hamilton was a wordsmith. Hamilton said many, many terrible things about Burr, but I have a hard time believing that Hamilton stooped to your mama jokes, okay? So Burr comes up to him and basically challenges him. Mr. Hamilton, did you in fact make these spurless comments about me? All Burr, or all Hamilton has to do at this point is say, no, I didn't say it. It didn't happen. And everything goes away. But Hamilton hates Burr so much that he can't even give him that victory. He can't even say, I didn't make a bad your mama joke about you. Hamilton's statement is, and I love this, this is one of my favorites. This is almost a verbatim quote. Hamilton says, Dear sir, I cannot possibly remember all of the horrible things I've said about you in my life, so I can neither confirm nor deny the accusation. You have got to love that. You have got to love that. So, Burr challenged him to a duel. Now, interestingly enough, Hamilton doesn't really believe in duels. His own son had died in a duel a year earlier. Hamilton had spoke out against dueling. And dueling was illegal in all 50 states, not in the Louisiana Territory, but in all 50 states it was illegal. But Hamilton is also a man of the 18th century, and this is how men dealt with things. They couldn't be seen to back down. They couldn't be seen to be afraid. So Hamilton accepted the duel. And the plan was that they would get up in the early morning hours, and along with their lieutenants, a witness, and a surgeon, they would each paddle their rowboats across the river to the plains of Weehawken, New Jersey. Why Weehawken, New Jersey? Well, it's this little spot on the river where New Jersey etches out into New York. So it's just this one little spot. And by going there and committing the crime of dueling there, they're theoretically out of reach of the police in New York. And if they go back to New York, they're out of reach of the police in New Jersey. So they paddled over there. And Hamilton makes an interesting statement on the way over. Hamilton says that he intends to reserve his shot. Now what that means is he intends to squander his shot, to waste his shot, to fire his shot off intentionally missing. And that seems odd. But what you have to know about this time period is that in duels, in most cases, nobody ever got shot. Pistols were incredibly inaccurate, and these men would get back to back and march off 10 paces apiece, so they're 20 paces apart. They would fire, and most of the time nobody hit anything. If you did hit something, it probably wasn't life-threatening. So it's kind of an interesting concept. So they meet here, they pace off the area, and it's time to fire. Up to this point, we only have one version of this story. But from this point forward, there are two. There is the Hamiltonian version and the Burrite version. According to the Burrites, that's the people that were there that supported Aaron Burr, and there weren't many of them. These two got back to back. They marched their 10 paces. They spun quickly, both fired, and Hamilton got his shot off first but missed. And then Burr shot, hitting Hamilton in the abdomen. The bullet went through his liver, and it got stuck in his spine. Hamilton died the next morning in his own home in New York. If the Burr version of the story is true, then this is a fair duel. It's a legitimate duel. But there's another version of the story, the Hamiltonian version. And according to this story, which is given some credence by some statements that Hamilton himself has made, they made their 10 paces, they spun around, and Hamilton raised his gun straight in the air, and he fired his single shot in the air, wasting his shot, or as they called it, reserving the shot. Once he had fired, the Hamiltonians say that Burr drew a round onto Hamilton, walked forward, and shot him at near point-blank range. If that version of the story is true, Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, just committed murder. We'll never know which one's true. I will say there seems to be some evidence. Hamilton had said the night before at a party and on the boat trip on the way over that he intended to reserve his shot and asked for God to protect him. And on the ship, on the boat back across, it was reported that he handed his pistol to his lieutenant and told him to be careful because it was still loaded. If that was the case, Hamilton may have believed that he had not fired the pistol. We will never know. Burr was arrested. Burr was charged with dueling, but eventually the charges were dropped. And the biggest reasons the charges were dropped is because America just wasn't ready to charge the Vice President of the United States with murder. This isn't the last time we're going to see Burr, though. Okay. Let's talk about the Burr Conspiracy. Happened about the same time period. We didn't even teach this when I was in school. I didn't learn about the Burr Conspiracy probably until I was in grad school. Aaron Burr has lost the presidency. He has been told that he will not be on the ticket in 1804 again to be vice president. He has lost his gubernatorial race. His political career is done. But he still wants to be famous. He still wants to be that big guy. So how do you go about doing that? Well, it turns out that he launches a secret plan. And there's a couple of versions of this. Burr seemed to be telling everybody something different. He told this guy, General James Wilkinson, make a note to yourself that James Wilkinson was the governor of the military territory of Louisiana. General Wilkinson was the governor of Louisiana. He tells Wilkinson that his plan was he would get a small army of a few hundred men, sail down the river system until he reaches the Mississippi, and then march west, gathering men as he goes. And James Wilkinson and his army would join him. And his plan, at least according to Wilkinson, was that they were going to march into Mexico and declare Aaron Burr King of Mexico. This is the Vice President of the United States plotting to declare himself king of Mexico. At the same time he's telling Wilkinson this, he sends messages to Spain, and remember, this is still Spanish Mexico. He sends messages to Spain and France, and he tells them his plan is to raise this army, march into Louisiana in the west, and take this territory from the United States, declare himself king of Louisiana, and maybe even invade the United States. He actually gets some money from Spain and France to do this, not very much. It seems that his ultimate plan was to unite the Federalists in New England and New York with this ragtag group of soldiers in Louisiana and eventually create a new rival nation in Louisiana, stretching all the way up into New York. But his plan doesn't go very well. People find out about it. Thomas Jefferson finds out, and the way he finds out is General Wilkinson gets cold feet, and he sends a message to the president telling him that your vice president is getting ready to try and steal half the country. Aaron Burr is ordered to be arrested. He is arrested. He escapes the first time. He's arrested and is being carried back to Washington. He manages to escape, makes it all the way into what's today Alabama, and is arrested again, hiding in a cave in Alabama, when somebody recognizes him as Vice President Burr. He is not charged for this, but he does flee the country. He ends up going to England, lives in England for a while, lives in France for a while, tries to raise some more money to invade the United States and make himself king, fails terribly, and later in life Aaron Burr returns back to the United States under a different name, and he dies in poverty. Aaron Burr is actually buried in London, I believe, in a pauper's grave, if I'm not mistaken. But this man that was so close to being president in 1800, by 1804 is a completely battered man. It's amazing how fast things fall. Amazing. By the way, if y'all haven't seen the news today, right before I came in here, I looked at it. They have picked up a pipe bomb at Hillary and Bill Clinton's house. They have intercepted one that was being mailed to President Obama. And last week they found one being mailed to George Soros. So we are in interesting times. And the Burr Conspiracy kind of reminds me of that. All right. So let's look at some problems Jefferson has. Jefferson does not want to go to war. More than anything else, Jefferson wants peace. So he passes what's called the Embargo Act. If you don't know what an embargo is when you refuse to purchase goods. Well, the thought here is, if Jefferson can keep Americans from purchasing goods, we won't get into a trade war with France or England. So this Embargo Act made it illegal for Americans to trade with any foreign nation. Well, okay, that keeps us out of a trade war, but you know what it does do is it means that Americans can't sell their goods. What are we going to do with our goods? Our farmers are in trouble. Our little bit of manufacturing we have is in trouble. America itself cannot finance our industry. We have to be able to sell. So the Federalists cry foul. They scream and holler. We've got to do something about this. This crazy guy Jefferson is embargoing everything. He's not letting us trade. So Jefferson says, fine, I'm going to give you something else instead. We'll pass what we call, and I'm sorry, it's a rather unfortunately named bill, but it's called the Non-Intercourse Act. The Non-Intercourse Act lifted the embargo from every nation except England and France. Well, that's great, except those are the only nations we traded with, okay? So lifting the embargo from everybody except England and France doesn't do us a whole lot of good, okay? The embargo does temporarily boost the Federalist hope. They're not able to win many elections, but for a brief minute, the Federalists start to come to power again. Our manufacturing grows because of it. Since we couldn't buy manufactured goods, we're going to be forced to manufacture our own. Now, we manufactured really bad goods. Our manufacturing was god-awful and terrible, but at least it was manufactured. If I go too fast for you guys, y'all are going to have to tell me. I don't have anybody here for me to be looking at and gauging against, okay? So call me on it if I go too fast, or, you know, whatever you've got to do to get my attention. All right. Y'all, everything okay? All right.
We're good.
Jefferson's legacy. What is going to be the long-term legacy of Thomas Jefferson? He is almost always listed as one of the 4 or 5 greatest presidents ever. He's usually number 3. Usually Washington, Lincoln, then Jefferson. Every now and then Franklin Roosevelt slides up there in front of him. But he's usually right there in the top 4 or 5 anyway. But Jefferson is very hard to get a grip on because in a lot of ways he left America divided. Remember, this is the guy that founded the first political party in American history. The Democratic Republicans, or Anti-Federalists, either title is fine, or Jeffersonian Republicans, he went by all 3, was the very first political party. And he divided this nation in a way that we have stayed divided ever since. We are a 2-party divided system because of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, being an anti-federalist, was very much against a strong executive. He feared a strong executive. He did not want concentration of power. He said over and over again that a president should be a tribune of the people. The president should be the voice of the people. He should not be acting on his own. Yet, once he comes to the office of the president, he oftentimes acted as a strong executive. He invented the modern presidency. Think about it. Jefferson, the man that says there should be no political parties, founded political parties. The guy that said that you only have those powers specifically granted. With the Louisiana Purchase, he didn't have it. He took it anyway. Over and over again, Jefferson is going to act unilaterally, just as most modern presidents did. The third one is one we don't talk about much. We always give Washington credit for this. Washington, at the end of 2 terms as president, surprised everybody when he refused a 3rd term. And every textbook talks about that. That Washington was afraid of any man getting too much power. But one person does not make a pattern. One person sometimes makes an accident. And while Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, John Adams lost his re-election bid when he stepped down. Thomas Jefferson, at the end of 2 terms, was still fairly popular. He could have easily won a 3rd term, and it was still legal back then. But Jefferson chose not. Excuse me. Jefferson chose not to run for a 3rd term because he feared the despotic powers of a president. He said if this were to happen, if we were ever to have somebody stay in power for too long, they would become a despot. You've heard the statements, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what Jefferson was afraid of. Jefferson was greatly afeared of any kind of concentration of power. So he does something. He's the guy that makes it a pattern. He steps down after 2 terms and sets the rule that's going to last all the way up until the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt. All right. So at the end of Jefferson's 2 terms, he steps down, and his hand-chosen replacement is his Secretary of State, James Madison, another Virginian, by the way. So now we are 3 of the first 4 presidents have been from Virginia. 2 of the first 4 presidents were former Secretaries of State. 2 were also vice presidents. So this guy, James Madison, or Little Jimmy Madison as they called him, because he was a really short guy. He was kind of square, short and fat. He is running as a Democratic Republican. There is no Federalist running against him. He is popular enough that they don't even try and unseat him. Remember, James Madison is the guy that we call the father of the Constitution. His notes tell us what happened. His voice can be felt all the way through the Constitution. Very popular. And he received all but 1 vote for president. One man, rather than vote for James Madison, threw his ticket away, threw his ballot away. And he said, no man but Washington should ever be unanimously elected. So even though James Madison was the only one running, he still didn't get all the votes. Still pretty impressive. Under Madison, they further ease up on the embargo. They passed what's called Macon's Bill No. 2. I'm sorry that's hard to read, guys. I have no idea why it changed the colors of my stuff whenever I uploaded it, but it did. Macon's Bill No. 2 states that the U.S. could trade with any nation except France and England, which is the same thing the Non-Intercourse Act said, but it adds this part. It says, whichever nation raises their trade restrictions with us first, that will be the exclusive trade partner of us. So we kind of put the ball in their hands. If you want to trade with the U.S., here's what you have to do. Napoleon lifts the trade restrictions, and the U.S. enters into a trade war against Great Britain on France's side. Probably not the best bet. Probably not at all the best decision we ever made. But we're now in a trade war with England. By the way, James Madison was the last president to wear the stupid little horsehair wig, okay? The rest of them will look much more modern to us. Jimmy Madison's going to have one other big problem. Congress is getting bigger. We're adding Western states. And Congress is also getting more Western and more youthful. This group of young Western politicians comes to power. And they're led by these 2 guys. That's Henry Clay at the top, and that's John C. Calhoun at the bottom. The one that looks strangely like Hillary Clinton in anger down there. Tell me it's not true. She does look like her. All right, so these 2 guys are both eager to go to war for a lot of reasons. England is doing 2 things that we are furious about. The first is impressment, and we've already talked about what that is. When you impress somebody, you force them into military service against their will. Hit them over the head with something, take them out to sea, and congratulations, you're in the British Navy. But the second thing they're doing is they're allying with the Indians and arming them to attack the Western settlements. So we don't much care for these. And the guys out west that are being attacked by these Indians are furious. Well, Henry Clay, gentleman at the top there, is elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. I believe he was 29 years old. Young man to be Speaker of the House. and they start pushing for war. The Easterners, particularly the Northeasterners, really don't want war. Because think about it. If you're in Boston, you're making your money in shipping. Do you really want to go to war with the most powerful navy in the world if you make your job as shipping? Plus, if you're on the East and you go to war with England, where do you think you're going to be attacked? They're going to burn those eastern cities. That's going to be where the war happens. If you're out in the West, if you're in Kentucky or Tennessee or the Carolinas, you're probably safe from the British, but you're not safe from the Indians. So these two guys are going to push for war. All right, that gets us through this section. We have one more section to do. We'll still be in the Age of Jefferson. It's just another part of it that'll go up there, where we're going to do the War of 1812. Your whole study guide is up. I told you last time I only put part of it up. I was mistaken. It is a whole study guide, so you can start working on it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. You can call me, text me, email me, send up smoke signals, telegram, whatever you want. Maybe use ESP if you think real hard. But I'm here if you need me, okay? See you guys later. Have a good day.
When did you say the test was?
It's going to be, let's see, today is, it's 1 week from Monday, we'll say.